The police cruiser rolled up to my curb at 8:37 on a Saturday morning, just as two men were carrying the walls of my screened pavilion through the side gate, and across the street Marilyn Voss stood in her bath, holding a coffee mug with both hands, watching like she had paid for a front row seat to my embarrassment. The officer stepped out, looked at the truck, looked at the stack of cedar panels in my driveway, then looked at me and said, "Sir, we got a report that somebody may be stripping materials from this property." I remember glancing right past him at Marilyn, and I thought, well, there it is, the seventh complaint. My name is Elliot Harper, and in the fall of 1999, I was 47 years old, living in a development called Willow Creek Estates, just outside Columbus, Ohio, back when people still settled neighborhood disputes with landlines, handwritten notes, certified mail, and the kind of gossip that traveled faster than any modem ever could. I worked as a maintenance supervisor for a medical supply warehouse on the south side of town, which meant I spent most of my days looking at work orders, inspection sheets, safety logs, and men who suddenly could not remember what they said 3 days earlier when a pump failed or a loading dock door came off its track. So I kept records, not because I enjoyed paperwork, Lord knows nobody enjoys paperwork, but because I had learned something simple over the years. The truth has a way of getting fuzzy when it becomes inconvenient for somebody. My house was a plain brick ranch with brown shutters, a cracked basketball hoop over the garage, and a backyard that sloped down toward a little line of maples. It was not fancy. I was not trying to make it fancy. My wife Rose and I bought it in 1994 because it was close enough to town for work and far enough out that you could still hear crickets in the summer. We raised our daughter Leah there, and for a while it was the kind of place where the grill smoked every Sunday. The neighbors borrowed each other's ladders, and nobody cared too much if a kid rode a bicycle through somebody else's lawn. Then Willow Creek Estates got itself a homeowners association, and after that everybody started caring about everything. The thing Marilyn Voss hated was a little screened pavilion I'd built in the spring of 1997. It was 12 feet by 14, cedar-framed, painted soft grey, with a green metal roof and white lattice along the bottom. It was not a mansion, not a garage, not a second house. It was a place to sit outside without being eaten alive by mosquitoes. Rose had been sick by then, and the doctors had told her to stay out of direct summer sun whenever she could, so I built the pavilion with a ceiling fan, a small ramp, and enough room for her wicker chair. We called it the summer room. That was Rose's name for it. She said calling it a pavilion made it sound like we were hosting a county fair. She would sit out there in the evenings with a glass of iced tea, her feet up on an old footstool, and she would say, "Elliot, you finally built something that did not wobble." That was her version of a love letter. I filed the drawings with the Willow Creek Design Committee before I bought a single board. I got the approval letter in writing, folded it in half, and kept it in a manila folder in my filing cabinet. The plans met the setback rules. The roof color was approved. The structure had no permanent walls, which mattered under the covenanters because enclosed additions had stricter requirements. Everything was proper. That should have been the end of it, but Marilyn Voss lived 2 houses down and served as chairwoman of the Neighborhood Design Committee, a title that sounded harmless until you realized it gave one person a great deal of influence over what counted as acceptable in your own yard. Marilyn was 56, always dressed like she might have to meet a realtor at any moment, even if she was only checking the mail. She had silver hair cut neatly at her chin, a blue Buick, and the yard so carefully trimmed that I used to think she probably measured the grass with a ruler. She was not loud. That was part of what made her difficult. Marilyn did not shout. She used a soft voice, a concerned smile, and phrases like, "I just want to protect the character of the neighborhood." She had once told me, standing at the edge of my driveway while I changed the oil in my truck, "Elliot, people move here because things are orderly." I said, "I thought people moved here because the houses were cheaper than Dublin." She did not laugh. The first complaint came before the pavilion was even finished. Marilyn claimed the roofline was too high. I showed the committee the approved drawing. Complaint dismissed. A month later, she said the green roof did not match the approved color sample. I showed them the receipt from the roofing supplier and the exact paint chip attached to my application. Complaint dismissed. Then she complained about the ceiling fan, said it was too noisy. The fan made less sound than her husband's lawnmower, and there was no rule about ceiling fans. Dismissed. Then it was the ramp, which she said made the structure look commercial. I explained that it was there because Rose had trouble with stairs. Dismissed. After Rose passed away in late 1997, I thought maybe Marilyn would leave it alone. I was wrong. In fact, that was when things got worse. She complained that the white lattice was too visible from the street, even though the pavilion was behind my house and partially hidden by the maples. Then she complained that I stored 2 folding chairs and a charcoal grill inside it during winter, which apparently transformed my backyard into some kind of outlaw warehouse. Every complaint was reviewed, every complaint was rejected, and every time I received another envelope from the association, I felt the same little tightening in my chest. It was not fear exactly. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes when somebody keeps knocking on your door, not hard enough to break it down, but often enough that you cannot relax in your own house. I did not understand Marilyn's real problem until the following spring. One evening she caught me getting the mail and said, "I hope you realize the board was very generous with you." I said, "Generous how?" She looked toward the back of my house and said, "That structure would not have been approved if it had permanent walls." I said, "It does not have permanent walls." She nodded once, slowly, like I had missed something obvious. Then she said, "My sunroom application was denied because of the side setback." That was the moment the whole thing clicked. 2 years before I built my pavilion, Marilyn had applied to add a glass sunroom onto the side of her house. The association denied it because the addition would have come too close to the property line. My pavilion met a different rule because it was detached and open on the sides, but Marilyn did not care about the distinction. In her mind, I had gotten something she had been denied, and every time she looked across the yards and saw that green roof, it reminded her of it. I said, "Marilyn, I did not write the rules." She gave me that little smile of hers and said, "No, but you certainly benefited from them." I wanted to say a lot of things. I wanted to tell her that my wife had spent some of her last decent afternoons in that structure, that the ramp was not a design statement, that I would have gladly torn the whole thing down if it meant Rose could have another summer in that chair. But I did not say any of it. I just said, "Good night, Marilyn," and went inside. By 1999, the summer room had become a place I barely used. Leah was 19 and off at college in Indiana, and I had started avoiding the pavilion because every object in it seemed to be waiting for Rose to come back. Her blue cushion was still in the corner. A wind chime she bought at a craft fair still hung by the doorway. There was a small faded stain on the floor where she once spilled grape juice and laughed until she cried because the dog stepped in it and tracked purple paw prints across the yard. People will tell you grief gets easier with time. I do not know if that is true. I think it just changes shape. One day you wake up and realize you are not holding your breath anymore, but then you walk past a chair and the whole year comes back to you. In July of 1999, I called Leah at her dorm and told her I was thinking about taking the pavilion down. There was a long pause on the line. Back then, long-distance calls still felt expensive enough that people did not waste silence, so I knew she was thinking hard. Finally, she said, "Dad, you are not doing that because of that woman, are you?" I stood in my kitchen looking through the window at the pavilion, and I said, "No, sweetheart. I am doing it because I do not want to spend another year treating a memory like a room I have to maintain." She was quiet again. Then she said, "What are you going to put there?" I told her I was thinking about a garden, maybe tomatoes, beans, peppers, some roses along the fence. Rose had always wanted a vegetable garden, but said the yard was too small, and I was too lazy to water it. Leah laughed at that, and for the first time in a long time, I did too. The decision was mine. That matters. I did not take down the pavilion because Marilyn wore me down. I took it down because I was ready to use that part of my life differently. But I also knew Marilyn would try to tell a different story. I knew she would say the structure had finally been removed because her complaints had worked. She had spent 2 years trying to turn a personal dislike into a violation, and I did not intend to hand her a victory speech wrapped in cedar boards. So I called a local attorney named Nina Caldwell. Nina had helped me once before when the association sent me a warning letter about the ramp, and she was one of those people who could make a sentence sound polite while quietly setting it on fire. I told her I planned to remove the pavilion, and she asked, "Do you expect trouble?" I said, "I expect Marilyn to make trouble out of an empty backyard if she thinks it will prove she was right." Nina gave a little laugh and said, "Then do not let her define the record." She prepared a letter stating that the pavilion had been properly approved, that all complaints against it had been dismissed, and that I was removing it voluntarily for personal reasons unrelated to any enforcement action. She also noted that I reserved the right to make future improvements in the space in accordance with the association rules. I had the letter notarized at the bank where the teller knew me by name. Then I mailed copies by certified mail to every board member. I saved the green receipt cards when they came back. I took photographs of the pavilion from every angle with a disposable Kodak camera, had the pictures developed at the drugstore, and wrote the date on the back of each one in black ink. I hired Henson & Sons, a small demolition and salvage crew run by a father and two grown boys, to dismantle the structure on a Saturday morning in October. I chose Saturday because that was when people would be home. I was not looking for an audience, exactly. But I had learned that witnesses are useful when somebody has spent 2 years trying to rewrite what happened. The crew arrived at 7 sharp. The sky was clear, the grass was wet with dew, and the air had that sharp Ohio smell that tells you fall is not pretending anymore. I had a folding table set up on my porch with the work order, the approval letter, the attorney letter, the old complaint notices, the photos, my property tax record, and the cancelled check from when I bought the lumber. One of the Henson boys looked at the table and said, "You expecting the IRS?" I told him, "No, worse, the Homeowners Association." He laughed, but his dad did not. He was old enough to understand. Marilyn came out around 8:15. She was wearing a white bathrobe and standing on her porch with a coffee mug. She watched the men remove the roof panels. She watched them carry out the ceiling fan. She watched them load the cedar posts into the truck. Then she went back inside. 20 minutes later, the police cruiser arrived. The officer was a broad-shouldered man in his 30s named Alan Ruiz. He had a calm face, the kind that probably helped when he had to knock on somebody's door after bad news. He told me a caller reported that multiple men were dismantling a structure and removing materials from my backyard. I said, "Officer, those men are being paid to do exactly that. The paperwork is right here." He looked at the work order, then the attorney letter, then the approval documents. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the pile of complaint notices. Then he looked at me and said, "You had all this ready before we got here?" I said, "I had a feeling somebody might confuse a contractor with a burglar." He looked over at Marilyn's house, then back at me. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Whoever made the call said the property owner might not be aware of what was happening." I said, "I am very aware. I hired them. I paid the deposit. I made coffee for them at 7 this morning." The officer nodded. He walked through the side gate, spoke with the Henson crew, checked the company name on the truck, and came back out. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Harbour," he said. "This is a legitimate removal." I said, "Officer Ruiz, would you put that in the report?" He raised his eyebrows. "You want an incident report?" I said, "Yes, sir. I would like it noted that law enforcement responded, verified ownership, verified contractor authorization, and found no criminal activity." He gave me a look that told me he understood exactly why I was asking. "All right," he said. "I will document it." Then he did something I did not expect. He lowered his voice and said, "For what it is worth, I see this kind of thing more than people think. Neighbors can get carried away." I said, "That is a gentle way to put it." He almost smiled. By 11:30, the pavilion was gone. All that remained was a square of flattened grass, a few anchor holes in the ground, and a pale rectangle where the sun had not reached the lawn in 2 years. I stood there after the truck left, holding Rose's old wind chime in one hand. It had been hanging from the doorway and I'd nearly forgotten it. I shook it once and listened to that little uneven clatter. Then I put it in a box and carried it inside. 2 days later, Officer Ruiz's report arrived. It stated that police had responded to a report of suspicious removal activity at my address, found a homeowner supervising a properly contracted demolition crew, reviewed documents confirming ownership and authorization, and determined the complaint was unfounded. The reporting party was listed as Marilyn Voss. I added it to the folder. By Monday morning, the whole street knew a police cruiser had been at my house. There was no neighborhood Facebook page back then, no group chat, no online board where people could pretend they were being polite while typing in all caps. There were just phone calls, kitchen windows, and people who suddenly found reasons to walk their dogs past your driveway. My next-door neighbor, Raymond Bell, came over that evening with a tin of oatmeal cookies his wife had made. Raymond was 72, retired from the county clerk's office, and had the habit of speaking slowly enough that everybody else stopped talking. He stood in my kitchen while I made coffee and said, "I saw the police car Saturday." I said, "Most of Columbus probably did." He shook his head. I also saw the first 4 complaints. My wife and I were on the board when they came through. I looked at him. He went on. I kept copies of the minutes. I keep copies of everything. Occupational hazard. I said, you too. He smiled. Elliot, the world belongs to people with filing cabinets. Then he reached into a folder under his arm and pulled out several pages. They were meeting minutes from the association, records showing each complaint against my pavilion had been reviewed and dismissed. He said, I do not like getting involved in neighbor business, but I like people using process as a weapon even less. I asked him if he would be willing to speak at the next board meeting. He took a sip of coffee, looked down at the report on my table, and said, if I am asked, I will tell the truth. The Willow Creek board meeting was held 2 weeks later in the little community room behind the leasing office, a beige box of a room with folding chairs, stale coffee, and a bulletin board covered with swim lessons and lost cat flyers. Normally, maybe 8 people showed up. That night there were 26. Folks came because they had heard half the story and wanted the other half. Some knew about the police call. Some thought the pavilion had been illegal. Some assumed I had been caught breaking rules. That was what Marilyn had counted on, I think. She had always understood that a vague accusation could do more damage than a clear lie, because people fill in the blanks with whatever makes the best story. Board President Doug Merritt opened the meeting with budget talk, snow removal contracts, and an argument about whether the entrance sign needed fresh paint. Then he cleared his throat and said, we have a matter concerning recent events at the Harper property that should be addressed openly. He looked at Marilyn, then at me. Mr. Harper, you submitted documentation to the board. Would you like to summarize? I stood up, carrying my folder. My hands were steady, but I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I said, I will keep this short. In 1997, I built a screen pavilion after receiving written design approval from this association. Over the following 2 years, 6 complaints were filed against that structure. Each complaint was dismissed because the pavilion complied with the covenanters and the approved plans. This October, I chose to remove the pavilion for personal reasons. I hired a licensed contractor, notified the board in advance, and submitted a notarized statement from my attorney confirming that the removal was voluntary and did not represent any admission of violation. On the morning of the removal, police were called to my home. The responding officer reviewed my documents, verified the contractor, and determined there was no criminal activity. I have the report here. It lists Marilyn Voss as the reporting party. You could have heard a pencil drop in that room. I put the police report on the table in front of Doug. I said, I am not asking the board to punish Marilyn. I am asking the board to enter into the official record that the pavilion was compliant throughout its existence, that its removal was my decision, and that the 6 complaints were dismissed. That is all. I sat down. Doug thanked me, then turned to Marilyn. Marilyn, because this involves actions tied to your committee, you will not participate in any vote tonight. You may speak if you wish. Marilyn rose slowly. She wore a navy blouse, pearl earrings, and the same expression she wore at every meeting, calm enough to make you think she was about to explain why the rest of the room had misunderstood basic arithmetic. She said, I filed my prior concerns in good faith, based on my understanding of the community standards. The board made its decisions, and I respected those decisions. She paused. As for the morning of the removal, I saw several men removing large portions of a structure from Mr. Rimyu, Harper's property. I did not know whether he had authorized it. I called police out of caution. I could not help myself. I leaned forward and said, Marilyn, you watched the truck pull into my driveway at 7. You saw the company name on the side. You watched me standing there with the crew for almost an hour. She looked at me, and for the first time in 2 years, I saw something slip behind her eyes. Not guilt, exactly. More like the sudden realization that the room had stopped taking her version of things for granted. Doug said, Mr. Misja, Harper, please let her finish. I nodded and sat back. Marilyn said, I believed it was appropriate to report suspicious activity. Then Raymond Bell raised his hand. Doug looked surprised. Mr. Bell, Raymond stood up slowly, holding his own folder. I have lived in this community for 13 years, he said. I served on the board for 5. I've reviewed the records related to this matter. I want to say something plainly because plain language has been missing here. He looked toward Marilyn, then toward the rest of us. Mr. Mekwishenzala, in midst of the rest of us. Harper's pavilion was not removed because it violated a rule. It was removed because he chose to remove it. The complaints against it were not successful because there was no violation to establish, and the police call was not a reasonable mistake. It was the latest step in a pattern of trying to make a compliant homeowner feel like he had done something wrong. Nobody moved. Raymond continued, "A complaint process exists to protect a neighborhood from genuine violations. It does not exist to enforce one person's personal taste. We should be careful about the power we hand people, especially when they learn to use it without restraint." He sat down. I will never forget the quiet after that. Marilyn stared at the front wall. Doug folded his hands and said the board will formally note that the Harper Pavilion complied with the relevant covenants while it stood, that its removal was voluntary, and that all previous complaints were dismissed. We will also review the complaint process, including a requirement that future complaints identify the exact covenant provision being alleged. Then he turned to me and said, "Mr. Harper, I am sorry this became what it became." I said, "Thank you." I did not feel triumphant. I expected to, maybe. I had spent 2 years imagining the moment somebody finally said out loud what Marilyn had been doing. But sitting there in that hot little room, looking at the woman who had made my home feel smaller, I mostly felt tired. On the way out, Raymond walked beside me in the parking lot. He said, "You did well." I said, "I did not do anything special." He looked at me and said, "You kept the facts from getting lonely." That was Raymond. He had a way of saying things that sounded odd for about 5 seconds, then stayed with you for years. 4 days after the meeting, a Thursday night, Marilyn knocked on my door. It was just after 8. I had been in the kitchen washing dishes, and when I opened the door, she was standing there in a cardigan with no makeup on, holding her purse in front of her like she needed something to do with her hands. For once, she did not look like the chairwoman of anything. She looked like a tired woman who had run out of places to hide. She said, "May I come in?" I almost said no. I would be lying if I told you otherwise, but I stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table. The wind chime from the pavilion was hanging in a box by the back door, and I could hear it tapping softly against the cardboard whenever the furnace kicked on. Marilyn looked around the room, then said, "The police call was wrong." I said, "Yes, it was." She nodded. "I knew the men were there to take down the pavilion. I saw the truck. I saw you talking to them." I did not say anything. She went on, "I called because I wanted someone official to look at it. I wanted something to happen." I said, "Why?" Her eyes filled up, but she did not cry. Marilyn was not built for crying in front of people. She said, "Because I spent 2 years telling myself that structure was bad for the neighborhood, and every time the board dismissed a complaint, it made me feel foolish. Then when you took it down, I thought maybe I could finally tell myself I had been right." I leaned back in my chair and said, "You were not right, Marilyn. You just did not like it." She looked down at her hands. "No," she said. "I did not like it. I did not like it. I did not like it. I did not like it for my yard. I did not like that your approval was different from mine. I did not like that I could not make a rule say what I wanted it to say." I let that sit there for a moment. Then I said, "That is a human thing to feel. But you had authority, and you used it to punish me for something that was not a violation." She nodded. "I know." I said, "You called the police on me while I was taking down the place my wife used to sit." Marilyn closed her eyes. "I know," she said again, softer this time. Then she said, "I am sorry. There are apologies that come easy because a person wants the discomfort to end, and there are apologies that cost something because the person has finally looked at themselves without the story they have been telling. I do not know which kind Marilyn's was. I still do not. But I looked at her and said, I accept that you are sorry. I do not accept that it was nothing." She nodded once. "That is fair." Before she left, she stopped by the door and said, "Your wife used to sit in there, did she not?" I said, "Yes." Marilyn looked out toward the dark backyard and said, "I should have known better than to make that place a battlefield." Then she left. I stood there for a while after she drove away, thinking about how strange people are. We like to believe there are heroes and villains, clean lines, good people and bad people. But most of the time, there are just people with power, pain, pride, and a habit of making excuses until the excuses become who they are. Marilyn had done something wrong. She had admitted it. Whether that was enough was a question I could not answer for anyone but myself. End The board changed the complaint policy before the end of the year. Starting in January 2000, nobody could file a covenant complaint without naming the specific rule they believed had been violated. If they could not point to a section, the complaint was returned without action. Doug called it a clarification, Raymond called it overdue. Marilyn abstained when the policy passed, then said, "I believe it is a good policy." I did not look at her when she said it, but I heard it. In the spring, I built 6 raised garden beds where the pavilion had stood. Not fancy ones, just cedar frames filled with dirt, mulch, and the kind of hope that comes with planting something you cannot yet see. Leah came home from college that April and helped me put tomatoes in the ground. We planted beans along the fence, peppers near the back, and 3 rose bushes beside the old maple tree. One of them was a deep red climbing rose, the kind Rose always liked. I hung her wind chime from a shepherd's hook near the garden gate. It made the same uneven little sound it had made by the pavilion doorway, but somehow it did not hurt as much there. It sounded less like goodbye and more like somebody reminding you to keep moving. Marilyn and I never became friends. We waved when we saw each other. Once, she asked me where I bought the mulch I used around the roses, and I told her. Another time, I helped her carry a broken bird feeder out to the curb before trash day. It was about as close as we got, and honestly, it was enough. A neighborhood does not need everybody to be friends. It needs people to know where the line is and to stop crossing it just because they can. I still have the folder from those years. It sits in the bottom drawer of a metal filing cabinet in my basement. Inside are the approval letter, the complaint notices, the green certified mail cards, the photos, the attorney letter, the police report, and the minutes from that board meeting. I do not look at it often. I do not need to, but I keep it because that folder tells the real story. It says a man built a place for his wife. It says a neighbor tried to turn dislike into law. It says a police call became proof instead of punishment. And it says that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm, keep your records, and refuse to let someone else tell the story of your own home. Now I want to ask you something. Was Marilyn's apology enough, or did she only apologize because the police report and the board meeting left her nowhere else to go? Was the board right to change the rules and move forward, or should there have been consequences for using the police to settle a personal score? Tell me what you think in the comments, because these neighborhood conflicts are never as simple as people pretend they are, and sometimes the real question is not who won, but what kind of person you become when you finally get the chance to be right.